In a quiet neighborhood far from the busy streets, there stood a house that most people ignored. It wasn't the biggest house, nor was it the smallest. It simply blended in, with its faded white walls and overgrown front yard. The neighbors passed by it every day, barely giving it a second glance. It was just another house on the block, another family living their lives behind closed doors. But what no one knew was that behind those closed doors, a terrible secret was growing in. Silence. For years, small signs appeared but were brushed away as unimportant. Sometimes, late at night, faint sounds came from the house. A soft cry, a quiet thump, a whisper too low to understand. People heard it but quickly convinced themselves it was just the sound of the wind or maybe a television playing too loudly. In the distance, some neighbors thought the family was just private. Others assumed they were simply busy or going through something personal. No one dared to ask. In this neighborhood, people preferred to keep to themselves. They waved at each other from across the street, but rarely knocked on doors. One person, however, noticed more than the rest. The local mail carrier, who delivered letters to every house in the area, started to grow uneasy. He saw that the mailbox of this house was always full. Letters, bills, and flyers stacked up day after day, untouched. He noticed that the windows were always shut, the curtains never drawn open. He remembered seeing the parents on rare occasions, quickly stepping out to grab groceries or packages, but he never saw a child, even though he had been told by others that a little girl lived there. As time passed, the feeling that something was wrong settled heavily in his chest. He could not ignore it any longer. The mail carrier reported his concern to the local authorities. He explained the untouched mail, the sealed windows, and the strange silence surrounding the house. His words reached the right ears. Officers were sent to perform a welfare check, something that, at first, seemed like just another routine task. When they arrived, they knocked firmly on the door, waiting for someone to answer. Minutes passed. They knocked again, louder this time. Still, there was no response. They walked around the property, peering through the cloudy windows, but the thick curtains blocked their view. The house, silent and still, offered no clues from the outside. Deciding they could not leave without answers, the officers forced their way inside. As they stepped through the doorway, they were greeted by a heavy, stale air, thick with dust and an unsettling smell. The house appeared frozen, as if time had stopped inside. Old furniture sat untouched, dishes lay stacked in the sink, and the walls, once painted bright colors, were now dull and cracked. The silence inside was deep, broken only by the officers' careful footsteps. They searched each room slowly, their unease growing with every turn. The house seemed empty at first, but in the back, they found a door that was tightly locked. It took time to break it open. What they found behind that door would stay with them forever. The scene was not loud, not violent, but it was more disturbing than anything they had expected. Sitting quietly on the cold floor was a young girl, thin as a shadow, wrapped in old, worn blankets. Her eyes barely lifted to meet theirs. She didn't scream or cry. She simply sat there, as if the world outside, that room, didn't exist. The weight of what the officers had discovered began to sink in. This was not just a welfare check. This was the beginning of uncovering something truly horrifying, a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. The girl was quickly taken from the house and rushed to the hospital. The paramedics moved fast, but what they saw deeply disturbed them. She was extremely underweight, her skin pale and marked by old bruises and scars that told a long and painful story. Her hair was tangled and matted, and her body seemed almost too fragile to touch. She was not just suffering from recent neglect. This had been going on for years. Her bones were weak and her muscles had barely developed. It became clear that this child had not experienced proper care or attention for most of her life. At the hospital, doctors and nurses worked carefully to stabilize her. They ran tests and gently cleaned her wounds. What they found was heartbreaking. She was severely malnourished, her body had stopped growing properly, and her organs showed signs of long-term damage from starvation. Old fractures that had healed badly were found in her arms and legs, and there were untreated injuries that had clearly been ignored. The signs were undeniable. This was not an accident, and this was not something that had just happened recently. This was long-term, intentional cruelty. Social workers immediately became involved. They tried to gather basic information about the girl, her name, her age, and anything she could tell them. But the girl spoke very little. Her words were soft and broken, as if she had forgotten how to speak fully. It was as if no one had talked to her in years. She didn't understand simple questions and barely reacted to the people around her. It seemed like she had been living in complete isolation, trapped in that small room, cut off from the world. Detectives now knew they were facing a case that was far more serious than anything they had expected. They returned to the house to search for more clues. Every room was carefully examined. They found locks on the outside of the girl's room door, confirming she had been purposely kept inside. There were signs that the room had not been cleaned or cared for in a very long time. Old food containers, torn clothing, and stained blankets were scattered across the floor. The window in the room had been nailed shut, and the light bulb overhead had been removed, leaving the space in almost complete darkness. In other parts of the house, life had seemed normal. There was fresh food in the kitchen and a working television. In the living room, the parents' bedroom was neat and had clean clothes and everyday items. It appeared that while the parents lived comfortably in the same house, they had completely abandoned their daughter to that back room, shutting her away as if she didn't exist. Detectives began to gather more evidence. They searched through medical records, school documents, and old family photos. The girl had once been enrolled in school, but several years earlier, her parents had suddenly claimed they would homeschool her. After that, there were no more public records of her activities, no school, no doctor visits, no social outings. She had simply vanished from the outside world. The investigation widened quickly. Authorities interviewed neighbors, distant relatives, and anyone who had ever had contact with the family. Over and over, they heard the same thing. People remembered the parents, but very few could recall seeing the girl. Some neighbors mentioned they occasionally heard soft crying or strange sounds coming from the house, but they had never seen any signs of violence or abuse. They thought the family was just quiet and private. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together. It was becoming painfully clear that this girl had lived trapped in silence and darkness for most of her life, hidden in plain sight while the world around her continued without ever noticing the terrible truth. The detectives continued to peel back the layers of the girl's life, determined to understand how such a tragedy had gone unnoticed for so long. They began by tracing the girl's early childhood. School records showed that she had been enrolled in kindergarten at the age of 5. At that time, there were no warning signs. Teachers described her as quiet but healthy, always sitting at the back of the class, often alone but attentive. She was present, she was visible, and she was part of the world. But then, without warning, her parents withdrew her from school. They filed paperwork claiming they would homeschool her. The school accepted the documents without question. There were no follow-up visits, no inspections, no demands for proof. Just like that, the girl's connection to the outside world was cut off. No one thought to check on her. Detectives found that shortly after the school withdrawal, the family moved to the house where the girl was later discovered. It was a quiet street, surrounded by neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. The parents were rarely seen and never socialized with the people living nearby. They left no space for curiosity. Their life was built around walls, both physical and emotional. As the investigation deepened, medical records surfaced that hinted at earlier neglect. Several years before the girl was found, she had been taken to an emergency room with a broken arm. At the time, the explanation had been that she fell down some stairs. The doctors noted that the parents seemed nervous but provided no solid evidence of abuse. The case was closed quickly, without further inquiry. Now in hindsight, it seemed like that injury had been one of many early warnings that went ignored. Detectives uncovered that child. Protective Services had never opened a formal case on the family. There had been no reports, no calls from neighbors, no official suspicions. The system had not failed to act. The system had simply never been alerted. In the absence of public signs, the girl disappeared completely. Neighbors began to recall strange, unsettling moments. Some remembered seeing the parents loading large bags of groceries into the house but never noticed any items meant for a child. No toys, no school supplies, no birthday decorations. Others mentioned hearing faint noises at odd hours, but they convinced themselves it was probably nothing serious. They believed that if something was truly wrong, someone else would have reported it. Everyone assumed someone else would act. No one did. Detectives found that the parents rarely left the house together. One was always home, watching the door. They were careful to maintain their isolation. Family members who lived in other cities told investigators that the parents had claimed their daughter was attending a special private school far away, which explained why she was never seen. They even went as far as sending out old photos of her to maintain the illusion that she was happy and thriving elsewhere. The most chilling discovery came when detectives found detailed, forged documents in the family's files. Fake school records, false medical forms, even carefully written fake progress reports were all part of a web of lies designed to keep anyone from asking too many questions. For years, the parents had planned and controlled every piece of information connected to their daughter, carefully erasing her from the community. The girl's life had been hidden in plain sight, but no one had looked closely enough to see the signs. The quiet street, the sealed windows, the neighbors who turned away, they had all played a part in allowing this nightmare to continue. What seemed like just another house in the neighborhood had actually been a prison, and what seemed like silence had actually been years of suffering. Unheard by the world outside, the detectives pressed forward, determined to uncover what had truly driven the parents to such deliberate cruelty. As they dug deeper into financial records, a troubling pattern began to emerge. For years, the parents had been receiving government assistance meant for the care and development of their daughter. Monthly payments, educational support funds, and health care benefits had been pouring in steadily. Yet none of those resources had ever been used for the girl's well-being. She had received no education, no medical care, and no proper nutrition. Instead, the money was spent on luxuries for the parents, new electronics, expensive furniture, online shopping, and frequent takeout meals. They had been living comfortably, while their daughter wasted away behind a locked door. The detectives realized that the parents had carefully built a life of lies to keep the benefits flowing without raising suspicion. They forged homeschooling documents year after year, making it appear that their daughter was thriving academically. They fabricated doctor visits and immunization records. They even prepared false letters from non-existent tutors and counselors. These lies were submitted to various agencies, and because the paperwork always appeared to be in order, no one ever questioned it. The parents understood the system well enough to trick it for years, all while keeping their daughter completely out of sight. But the financial motive alone didn't fully explain the depth of their actions. Investigators began to piece together the parents' psychological profiles. It became clear that they had developed an obsession with control. Everything in their lives had been designed to be tightly managed, from the smallest details of their finances to the complete isolation of their child. They did not simply neglect her, they erased her. She was not allowed to exist beyond the walls of her room. She became an invisible part of their lives, kept only because her existence continued to bring them financial gain. The detectives also discovered that the parents had no close friends and had cut ties with most of their extended family. They avoided family gatherings, school events, and community activities. Their world was carefully limited to prevent any accidental discovery. When distant relatives called to ask about the girl, the parents always had a new story prepared. Sometimes they claimed she was away on a school trip. Other times they said she was sick and could not come to the phone. Every excuse was delivered with just enough detail to sound believable, but not enough to invite further questions. One of the most disturbing findings came from the parents' online activity. They had visited countless forums and websites about homeschooling and parenting laws, carefully researching how to avoid mandatory home inspections and how to legally bypass school requirements. They had even joined online groups where people discussed how to limit government involvement in family matters. It was clear that they had not simply fallen into this behavior. They had planned it, step by step, over many years. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not a case of poor parenting or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate system of abuse, designed to hide the girl while extracting as much benefit as possible from her continued existence on paper. The lies were so complete, the deception so carefully maintained, that the parents had managed to keep their secret intact for nearly a decade. But now the walls they had built were starting to crumble. The truth had broken free, and the life they had controlled so tightly was beginning to collapse around them. What remained was the girl they had hidden, a silent witness to the years of cruelty they had inflicted. Her survival was the only thing they had not planned for, and it was her quiet presence that would ultimately bring their carefully built lies to an end. As the case moved forward, the weight of the story spread far beyond the small neighborhood where the girl had been trapped. News outlets picked up the investigation, and soon, the entire country was talking about the worst case of child abuse detectives had ever seen. People struggled to understand how something so terrible could happen in an ordinary house in plain sight, without anyone stepping in to help. The community, once quiet and distant, was now filled with regret and shame. Neighbors questioned how they had missed the signs and why no one had asked harder questions. The girl, now free from the walls that had confined her, was placed in protective care. She began a slow and painful journey toward recovery. Medical. Teams worked around the clock to restore her physical health, while therapists and counselors patiently helped her begin to understand the world beyond her small locked room. For her, simple things like sunlight, warm meals, and soft blankets were completely new. She had lived so long without them that the outside world seemed strange and overwhelming. Her progress was slow, but with each passing day, she took small steps forward, learning to speak more, to trust, and to feel safe. The legal process moved quickly. The evidence against the parents was overwhelming. Every forged document, every financial record, and every carefully built lie was laid out in court. The courtroom was silent as the details of the girl's life were revealed piece by piece. The parents showed no real signs of remorse. They sat quietly as the truth unfolded, their years of deception now fully exposed. The court handed down a severe sentence, ensuring they would spend many years away from society, unable to harm anyone else. The case led to widespread public discussion about how the system had failed. New rules were introduced, making it more difficult for children to simply disappear under the claim of homeschooling. Authorities put in place stricter welfare check requirements and created faster response systems for when schools or neighbors raised concerns. Social workers and educators were trained to notice the small signs, the quiet clues that often go ignored. But even as these changes were made, the sadness of the case remained. The years that had been stolen from the girl could never be given back. The childhood she lost was gone forever. She had been kept in silence, separated from the simplest joys of life, while those around her lived without ever knowing she was suffering just steps away. The detectives who worked on the case carried it with them long after it was officially closed. They admitted it had changed them, shaken them in ways they had never experienced before. They had seen many forms of cruelty in their careers, but this one stood out. It was not loud or violent in the way most people imagined abuse to be. It was quiet, hidden, built over time through careful lies and cold neglect. It was a cruelty that left no fresh bruises but scarred deeper than anyone could see. In time, the girl began to smile again. She made slow connections with her new caregivers and showed a quiet strength that surprised everyone around her. Though her story had begun in darkness, her future now had a chance to be different. She would never fully forget the years spent alone, but she would not return to them. The story served as a warning to everyone who heard it. Sometimes, the worst suffering is not where people expect to find it. Sometimes, it hides behind ordinary doors, on quiet streets, where silence can drown out even the loudest cries for help. And sometimes, noticing the smallest details can save a life.